Today we're going to be looking at the worshiping principle for how to delight in the Sabbath. You know, Ellen White kind of captures that thought in Counsels to the Church, page 270, when she says, of all the days in the week, none are so favorable for devotional thoughts and feelings as the Sabbath. I agree. We're going to unpack that some more today. You know, when I was a kid growing up, our family would have we would have devotions and family devotions and worship most nights. But on Friday nights, we would have some more special extra time for family worship. And I think back to those with fondness. Sometimes we would each have a hymnal and we'd each pick a hymn to sing. Sometimes we would read true moral stories that we could relate to, especially as kids. And then sometimes we would each have a copy of an Ellen White book, and like Messages to Young People and Last Day Events, and we would each read a paragraph and we'd discuss the topics being discussed. And so I really remember family worships growing up as a very special thing, especially for Friday nights to welcome Sabbath and Saturday nights as well. So what's this connection between worship and Sabbath? It seems like a logical one, but let's unpack it a little bit more and see how we can apply it to our lives. So our first verse we're going to look at is in Leviticus 23, verse 3. And it says, 6 days you shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. So what are we to do on Sabbath according to this verse? Well, it says we are to have a day of, part of it that I want to focus on is the holy convocation. We're to have a holy convocation. So we'd call this the corporate worship. That's one important aspect of the Sabbath, and that's one way we delight in the Sabbath is by all coming together and together worshiping God. You know, I think that Paul anticipated that this might be something we'd be tempted to give up when he wrote in Hebrews chapter 10 verses 24 and 25. He said, "And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much more as you see the day approaching." So he really encourages us, even as we get closer to Jesus' coming, that we not give up meeting together, including the Sabbath, probably other times as well, but especially the Sabbath. And it's interesting that he tells us why. The first reason is to stir up love and good works. And the second is to exhort one another. To exhort means to encourage and to strongly encourage each other to do things that we should. There is such a blessing in coming together and worshiping together and sharing prayer requests and praises and having that sense of community with other believers, that it is a very valuable blessing and a part of the worship. And then our next verse is in Isaiah 66:23. And it says, "And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, all flesh shall come to worship before me, says the Lord." So even in the new earth and heaven, we're going to be coming together to corporately worship God on Sabbath. It's a beautiful, important element that we gather together and we worship together. You know, it makes me think about what about this whole idea of staying home and just worshiping God by watching a sermon and things, which at times we have to do. Certainly during times of pandemic, we have to do that. But I even remember a few times, just maybe a couple times in my childhood, when there was some serious blizzards going on. And we lived like 5 miles away from our country church, and it was not safe to drive to church on those country roads. But it was a very, very rare thing that we missed church. I can't even remember a time that we missed church for sickness even growing up. So, you know, there may be circumstances certainly where we have to have church by watching the sermon, but that should be the exception versus the rule, because we miss out on the blessings that Paul talked about in Hebrews. And we know that this is something important to Jesus even, because in Luke 4:16 it tells us, "So he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read." So Jesus even practiced consistently going to church. He was in the habit of going to the synagogue and worshiping God corporately with other believers on the Sabbath. It should be a lifestyle that we have, and it's such a blessing to do that. So what about this question, why should we worship God on the Sabbath? This seems like an obvious question, but let's also tie it into how does this help us delight in God in the Sabbath? Well, by worshiping on the Sabbath, we are saying that He is our God, He is our creator, and we're the creatures. He gets to tell us what to do. We choose to serve Him. That's part of what worshiping is. Revelation 4:11 says, "You are worthy, O Lord, to receive all glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created." And Matthew 4:10, Jesus, this is during His temptation, but He said, "You shall worship the Lord your God, and Him only shall you serve." So when we worship God on Sabbath, that's part of what we're saying. You're my God. You are who I worship. You're the only one that I bow down to. I take my orders, my commands in life from you. That's one thing we're saying. The second thing we're saying is that the Sabbath is holy. We know in Genesis 2:3 that the Sabbath was made holy and sanctified by God. And I like how Abraham, scholar, he's a Jewish scholar, Abraham Joshua Heschel, he calls the Sabbath a palace in time. To think of Sabbath as a palace in time, that it is holy, it is sanctified, and when we come together and worship God on Sabbath in an extra special way, because we should worship God every day, but in an extra special way on Sabbath, we are acknowledging that the Sabbath is holy. The third thing we are saying by worshiping on Sabbath is that we love God, because John 14:15 says, "If you love me, keep my commandments." And so we are expressing our love to God by doing that. We are also expressing delight in God by worshiping with Him and of Him. Psalms 95:6 says, "Oh come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker." And that's an important thing to recognize. He's our Maker. When we are worshiping, He is our Maker. We are His creatures, and it's helping that restore that connection between Creator and creature, between God and us. So let's talk about some ways we can practically apply some ideas for how to worship and get the most out of worship and Sabbath. Well, one thing I like to do is get up a little bit early on Sabbath morning and spend some extra time in my Bible and in worship and prayer. And that is just such a blessing. And I also try to do that in Sabbath afternoon, have some extra special time. More than I am able to on other days of the week, spend some more time with God. Plus, of course, going to church. Another idea, and Ellen White gives this tip in Education page 252, she suggests that kids and parents take note of each Bible verse that's given during the sermon, and that you share those verses or the main points or something that you thought was worth remembering from the sermon during your meal afterwards, and it helps everybody pay attention and make sense of the thoughts in the sermon. I remember watching a coworker once who was diligently taking notes every Sabbath and admired her for doing that. And she said that helped her pay attention and concentrate, and that helped her get the most out of the sermon. So that's an idea. Maybe you want to, it's always so beautiful to open and close the Sabbath with a very special worship time if you're single or if you're married, to gather together your family and spend that worship time with God. So those are some beautiful practical tips, and there's many more. I'll try to post some more under the video as well of how to get more worship, beauty, delighting in God on Sabbath. To close, I want to tell you a story. This is from Guide's Greatest Sabbath Stories book. And this is a story of a girl who chose to keep Sabbath as a day of worship rather than just pursuing her own dreams on that day. The girl's name was Susan, and she was really excited. She went to an Adventist academy in Ohio, and she had been selected to run in the Junior Olympic track team for ages 15 to 17-year-olds. And she loved to run, so this was a dream come true. So she filled out the application. She was assigned her first race, and she was excited because there was only one other girl running, and so she was like, yay, I'm going to at least get silver medal in this race. And that's what she got. She came in but just seconds behind the girl in front of her. And the coach came up to her and asked her how she felt, and she said, I feel great. I'm ready to run my next race. When can I run again? And he said, how would you like to try out for the state cross-country track team? And she was really excited about that idea. But then she paused and thought to ask, but when are those races scheduled? And he said, well, they're usually Saturdays. And her heart sank because that's her Sabbath. And then the coach realized that, and he said, oh, but I know you're Seventh-day Adventist, but you can still run, can't you? I'm sure your church wouldn't object under these circumstances. And Susan's response was really powerful. She said, sir, it's not a matter of what my church thinks. It's what the Bible teaches and what I personally believe. Saturday, my Sabbath, is the day I set apart to honor and worship God. I don't feel that I can participate in sports events on Saturdays. I wouldn't be honoring God if I did. My mind would be on my personal honor and glory. And the coach kept coaxing her. He's like, I'm sure it's okay. I've had other Adventists run for me on Saturdays, so I know it can be arranged. Think it over and let me know. Well, she did think about it, and she was sad as she thought about it. Why did other Adventists have to run on Sabbath? It only made it harder for those who were trying to do what was right. And she held that silver medal in her hand that she'd just won. And she thought, wow, I could win a lot more if I joined that track team, and wouldn't that be so much fun? And it was tempting. But then she thought of another race, the race of life. And she thought, well, it doesn't matter what other Adventists choose to do. As for me, I choose to keep Sabbath holy as a day to think about God, to focus on God and delighting in God and my relationship with God. And I'm determined to win something greater than a silver medal. I'm determined to win the crown of life. And that's what I want to challenge you to do, is to think about how you can worship God on Sabbath in a beautiful, meaningful way, and how we can work towards that crown of life experience with God, where we're connecting with Him on that day, where we're remembering how great He is, how He's our Creator, and spending extra time worshiping Him. I hope this is a blessing for you, and I hope that your worship experience with God does truly grow each Sabbath day.